Hello and welcome to my channel. In this one I'm going to be doing a graphite pencil drawing of MiG-21, the famous Soviet fighter plane. Because this one requires a little bit more precision and accuracy, I'm actually going to use a ruler a little bit for some of the straighter lines. Now, I want to say a few words about my materials, the composition, the reference, the general idea. The reference will be in the description, but you will see that I made some changes to it because I wanted the Soviet markings and slightly different camo. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, as for the materials, I'm using the Koh-i-Noor graphite pencils on Fabriano sketching paper. This paper has a nice tooth for working with graphite, and the size is about 9 × 11 inches. In addition to the graphite pencils, naturally I will use some blending and erasing tools, and I'm going to talk about these during the drawing process. As for the composition, I want this to be like a vignette. I've already done similar things with the drawings of aeroplanes, so I'm going to make some suggestions of clouds and things like that, just to give my main subject a bit of a context. So as you can see, some of the things I drew using freehand, some of it using the ruler. But now I'm starting to shade the background. And as I've already mentioned, it will be a vignette. I don't plan to do the entire background. I will just fade the outer edge a little bit and then maybe draw a few details in the back. I need to establish a little bit of value in the background because I'm going to be drawing some clouds, so basically just some suggestions of clouds. I'm using a very light amount of value. I used an HB pencil, and now I'm blending that. I'm blending it with a combination of blending tools. I used a brush, I'm using a Q-tip. I want to blend this evenly and smoothly because I want to remove all of those lines and I don't want any texture in the background. Around the edges, I want to fade it towards the edge of the paper because, like I said, I want to smooth that transition from my vignette onto the white of the paper. I'm using the brush again. I use a soft synthetic brush just to even it out a little bit. And then around the edges I just use the paper tissue to fade it towards the edge. Now I'm drawing some small suggestions of clouds in the distance below the plane, and for those I'm using the Tombow Mono Zero eraser. For those of you who are not familiar with this, this is a sort of a mechanical precision eraser, and it allows you to draw some smaller, lighter shapes, thin lines and things like that. So it's basically like working with mechanical pencil, except that instead of drawing darker marks, you're drawing lighter marks by erasing. And in order for those marks to show up, you need to shade the background first, which I did. I shaded the background, and now these clouds are showing up. If there wasn't a sufficient amount of value, those would not be visible. Anyway, I'm starting to work on my main subject, which is of course the MiG-21 fighter plane. And I started with the nose. This part is usually darker. On some planes it's of black color, sometimes it's red, sometimes it's dark green. Around the nose there is an opening for the air intake, and for these darker details, naturally I will use softer pencils, softer grades of pencils like 7B and 8B. For the lighter details I use harder pencils like HB or sometimes even a 2H. So like I said, I'm using the Koh-i-Noor graphite pencils because those are the ones that I have. You can use any other brand. Graphite pencils, generally speaking, are a very convenient, easy to use tool. They're relatively cheap, and they have some great advantages. They're kind of clean to work with, at least in comparison to charcoal. For example, a drawing like this would be much more difficult in charcoal, in my opinion, because it would be a little bit messier and it would be more difficult to draw these tiny shapes. I'm drawing some details in the cockpit, and here I'm using the 8B pencil because some of these shapes are fairly dark in comparison to the rest of the airplane. I also drew the pilot, the head-up display area, but obviously some of these details are kind of tiny and not that easy to discern, but like I said, just a few suggestions of shapes can make a huge difference to the eye of the viewer. Every now and then I blend with a tortillon as well. A tortillon has a fine tip and it can allow you to blend much smaller shapes. So now I'm going to shade the airplane, or at least the nose area of the airplane. For this I will switch to slightly darker pencils, or something in between rather, using a 2B. And then once I establish some of the larger relationships, I will add some details on top. When I say larger relationships, I mean the contrast in value between the light side and the shadow side. The bottom portion of the plane, or at least the bottom side, the side of the plane which is facing down, is going to be darker because it's facing away from the light source. And there's also going to be some shadow under the wings and in some other areas, because the wings will be casting that shadow down onto whatever it is under them. And here I'm making this lower portion a little bit darker, using the 7B and adding some other small details as well. Of course, I'm not going to leave it like that. Once I shade it, I blend, and now I'm blending with a brush. I usually like to use flat brushes for blending, and sometimes it's very good to rotate a drawing, because this way you can point the tip of the brush towards the edge, and that way you can blend to the edge and not go over it. This is a way to preserve clean edges to value when those are important, and here they are important because I want to have a clean edge to value between the airplane and the background. So I already mentioned that I will change the markings and the insignia in comparison to the reference photo. I'm going to add a number here, and the number itself has an edge, like a white edge around it. So at first I drew the light shape, and then I drew the number inside it. I was kind of surprised with how much precision I was able to do this. I know it's not perfect, but I'm still happy with the way it turned out. I don't know if you can tell also, here under the wing on one of the attachment points you can see a tiny lighter shape. That's supposed to be an air-to-air missile, a short-range air-to-air missile, and then in front of it we have a large external fuel tank. So that's not a rocket or a bomb, that's most likely an external fuel tank. I'm not an expert, so I'm going to try to describe some of these shapes and parts of the airplane as best as I can. I just know a little bit more than the average person because, reading a little bit about airplanes used to be my hobby. I'm not really into war or anything. I just like airplanes in the way that people like cars. So I thought that this would be an interesting subject to draw. And just below this one and under the fuselage, there's going to be another external fuel tank. And both of these are going to be a little bit darker, partly because of the color and also because of the shadows on them. But I also have to establish the contrast between the part of that fuel tank which is not in the shadow and the part of it which is in the shadow. And the shadow, like I said, is coming from the wing, and the fuel tank that is attached on the wing is also casting a bit of shadow onto the fuel tank that is under the fuselage. So there are a lot of interesting shadows here, and that's probably the main reason why I picked this reference photo. When you're drawing things like machines, airplanes, cars and things like that, I think that the key to make these things interesting and engaging for the viewers is to find a good reference photo, because if it's kind of flat, if it doesn't have any interesting shadows, the shape itself won't be interesting to the viewer, and not everybody's interested in airplanes, so you got to give them something that will be engaging and that will look like a good opportunity to practice and to learn something about drawing. And I think some of these contrasts and shadows that we can see here are a very good opportunity for that. So there's a little bit more shadow here as well, and you can see how some parts of this fuel tank are kind of popping out of that shadow, which I like because it creates a nice contrast. I'm continuing to shade the wings now and the rest of the fuselage in the middle. We can't really see much of the wings because of the angle. They are foreshortened, so we can only get a sort of vague idea about their overall size and shape. The MiG-21 has slightly unusual wings because they look kind of like a delta wing, but the MiG-21 also has the horizontal stabilizers behind. So that's a slightly unusual solution. I find that the MiG-21 is somewhat unusual in terms of its shape, because if you look at the Soviet fighters and the Western fighters, you will often find a lot of similarities between different fighters of the same or similar era, but the MiG-21 is quite a bit different than anything that we saw among the Western equivalents, I suppose. There's another darker shape here at the top of this vertical stabilizer. I don't really know what that is. It's usually of darker color, usually either black or dark red or dark green. So I don't really know what all of these parts are supposed to be, but I don't really need to know. I don't really need to understand every single detail because I'm not a mechanical engineer, I'm just an artist. And as long as I can interpret the shape with a decent amount of accuracy, it's going to be fine, because most of you won't mind. There's another shape here about the wings, so I don't know what that is either, but I included that as well. And now I'm just refining the amount of value on the lower part of the nose area. Here I'm going to make some suggestions of camo pattern. So I had a couple of options with the color of the airplane. I could have tried to make it look white, which was the early camo, if you will, of the Soviet MiG-21 planes, but I didn't really like that. I wanted the shape of the plane to stand out darker against the background, so I picked a camo version. Those were more typical of the late 70s, early 80s era of the Soviet Air Force. So I'm just adding some slightly darker areas so that I would have variation in color that kind of looks like a camo pattern. It doesn't have to be perfect and it doesn't have to be super accurate, but with just a few suggestions of variation in color, I think I can get it to look close to the real thing. This small pointy shape below the vertical stabilizer is where the parachute, the landing parachute, is housed. It probably pops open when the plane is landing and the parachute spreads and slows down the plane, shortening the landing distance. And this dark opening here is the exhaust of the engine. So I use an 8B for that. That's going to be almost completely black. And then around the exhaust, I'm going to shade this part, which has a kind of a metallic shine to it. It's kind of reflective, and in order to do that, I have to leave this part lighter and make some parts of it a little bit darker, so that it looks like that part of the middle is shining or is reflecting a little bit of light. So I'm trying to imitate both the shapes as well as the texture and the material that I'm trying to draw. I shaded the large vertical stabilizer and cleaned up the edges a little bit. This is another antenna there at the top. I don't know what it's for, but now I'm going to draw the star here, and it has a white edge around it, so I first erased the lighter shape and then I drew the star inside and cleaned up the outer edges a little bit as best as I could, because it is a smaller shape. But the good thing about graphite pencils is that they really give you a lot of precision and accuracy, and this is something that you cannot get from many other types of media. The graphite has its limitations, of course. Sometimes it can be difficult to draw things that require a lot of blending, a lot of large dark areas. Stuff like that is usually better in charcoal, but here for this type of a subject I thought that graphite would be perfect, especially because of the amount of smaller details. So I'm just refining the appearance of that vertical fin or that vertical stabilizer and adding some smaller details. And now I'm going to add a little bit more shadow between the top part of the fuselage and the rest. And on this bottom portion here, I don't really know what this part is for. It looks like some other form of vertical stabilizer, except for the fact that it's under the fuselage. And now I'm shading that rear part of the fuselage and adding some shadow under the horizontal stabilizer, because remember the light is coming from above, so the wings and the horizontal stabilizers will be casting a shadow down onto the fuselage. Just blending that with a brush, refining some of the smaller details and edges, adding a little bit more shadow here and there, and some smaller shapes that I see on the reference. Like I said, I don't really know what each and every one of those smaller shapes is supposed to represent, but in order to make the appearance of the aircraft more complex and more detailed, I will include maybe not all of them, but most of them. Just adding some of these vertical lines where some of the seams are in the body of the airplane, as well as some of these smaller shapes like dot-like shapes, whatever they are. And here on the middle part of the fuselage as well. And there needs to be a little bit of shadow between that top part of the fuselage and the rest of it, because that top part is kind of bulging out a little bit. I didn't really want to draw that with a ruler because it feels like it curves a little bit, I'm not sure. But I think I did a decent job using a combination of a ruler and freehand. Just adding some more suggestions of that camo pattern here at the back. Like I said, it doesn't have to be super elaborate, but as long as we can see some variation, it's probably going to look good enough. I also added a little bit more shadow on that lower part under the horizontal stabilizers. And now that I'm mostly done, I'm gonna put my signature here on the right side. I forgot to shade this part of the horizontal stabilizer a little bit. I'm going to shade it in such a way so that it's reflecting some of the details above it, because that exhaust area has some shiny lighter and some darker details. I'm going to make it look like this horizontal surface of the horizontal stabilizer is reflecting some of those shapes. So I put in some of the darker shapes first, and then with an eraser I'm going to put in a few lighter touches as well, and I think that's a very nice detail that makes the whole thing a bit more realistic. Just doing a little bit more cleaning up and some finishing touches. I like to do the cleaning up with the kneaded eraser. And now the drawing is almost done. I'm just gonna clean up the upper edge here a little bit more. I hope you like the way it turned out. Don't forget to check out my other videos. For more content and full-length videos, you should check out my Patreon. Bye bye.